Beginning in 1902, the British archaeologist Stuart McAllister began excavating at Gezer. On the Acropolis of the site, McAllister noticed that there was a row of stones whose tops were protruding through the ground. And so he began excavating the area and unearthed 12 standing stones in a row. And next to them was another huge stone with a flat top and a basin carved into it. And as he was excavating this area, he realized that he was digging a Canaanite high place where the ancient inhabitants of the city had worshipped their gods. Now, what McAllister found next around these standing stones is deeply disturbing. However, it shouldn't be surprising because it was evidence for a Canaanite worship practice that is described in the Bible. The city of Gezer is mentioned in the Bible several times and is located in Israel between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. I just want you to look at how big these stones are. So in his excavation report, McAllister found a pit which he described as being filled with a great number of bones of human beings in a confused heap. And nearby was the skeleton of a young girl who had evidently been sawn asunder. She had been cut in half. And found along with this the skulls of two other girls who had been decapitated, and this could be determined because of the cut marks through the vertebrae. And then McAllister says that all around the feet of the columns, that is the standing stones, McAllister discovered the skeletons of young infants. They were deposited in large jars, and the skeletons showed marks of fire. He started finding all over the place here, around the base of these pillars, jars with burned human babies inside of them. Okay, and this is from his excavation report. You can see the skeletal remains of a burned baby inside of the jar. Buried ritually. Not just buried, but buried ritually. Now, how are they buried ritually? They're buried in a place of sacrifice, in a sacred place of worship. So in his excavation report, McAllister made a plan of the high place from the perspective of looking straight down on it. And then on this top plan, he marked with the letter J everywhere where he had found these infant jar burials. Look at all the J's, J, 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 J. See all the J's? Jar burials with not just baby bones in them, burned baby bones in them. Okay, this is about a 6, 7-year-old girl that was cut in half. You can tell, by the way, when they're cut in half because you have a cut mark right through the vertebrae, right through the bones. Below this area, McAllister discovered a cave. And when his team cleared it, a flat stone was found at the center of the cave. Still lying upon it were the remains of the skeleton of a human infant. I know this is sobering. I know you're not having a good time, but you either want to know what's actually found in the ground or you don't. And it's important to know what's actually found in the ground. So essentially, for McAllister, it was like excavating a crime scene. What happened here? What was going on? And so he had the evidence, but he still needed to interpret it. And what McAllister used to interpret what he'd found in the ground was the Bible. Numbers 13:29 says that the Amorites live in the hill country of Canaan. Since Gezer was located in the hill country of Canaan, he interpreted it to be an Amorite city. So who were the Amorites? They were Canaanites. Why? Because they descended from the man Canaan. And the Amorites were the most powerful of the Canaanite tribes. McAllister used Exodus 23 that mentions the Amorites' sacred stones
To identify the row of sacred stones he had unearthed at Gezer. The other large stone with a flat top he identified as an altar, and the purpose of its carved-out basin was for catching the blood of sacrifices. Based on these verses, McAllister knew the site he was excavating was a Canaanite high place where Amorites had worshipped their gods. The many idols found in the area provided evidence that this was a cultic site. Among the many idols that were found was a bronze serpent representing Moloch, the king of the Amorite gods.
You remember reading about Moloch in the Bible? This is how he is represented, a snake. Who do you think the snake is that's getting the Canaanites to sacrifice their own children?
In Deuteronomy 12:31, the Lord says to the Israelites, "You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods." Using this verse and others like it, McAllister labeled the picture of the remains of a burned human baby as a sacrificed infant buried in a jar. The severed human remains he also interpreted as evidence for child sacrifice. What was the crime? Child sacrifice. What was the evidence? The remains of sacrificed children.
Think about it. What other explanation is there for burned babies in a jar around standing stones?
So it's important to point out that McAllister wasn't interpreting these finds in some bizarre way. The other archaeologists that were digging in Canaanite cities were finding similar remains, and they were interpreting them in the same way. Just to give one brief example, Kathleen Kenyon was excavating in the 1950s in the Amorite city of Jericho. And in her book, Digging Up Jericho, she wrote, "There is an unpleasant suggestion of infant sacrifice. Besides one complete infant burial, a collection of infant skulls with the neck vertebrae attached, showing that the heads were cut off and not merely collected from burials." And so McAllister took the evidence of child sacrifice he had found and wrote it up in a chapter that he titled, "The Iniquity of the Amorites." It's interesting in these early days how McAllister goes a step further, and he not only uses the Bible to interpret the evidence that he finds in the ground, but he also uses it theologically to identify this is evidence for iniquity. This is evidence for sin. Why did McAllister call this child sacrifice sin? Because the Bible called it sin. Why is it sin? Because the Lord hates this practice and it's against his law. When God gave his law to his people Israel, it was against the law to sacrifice their children. In Leviticus 18:21, God commands Israel, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Moloch." Leviticus 20 verse 2 states, "Any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Moloch is to be put to death." Child sacrifice is sin because it is against God's law, and the penalty for committing this sin was death. So God in the Bible is accusing the Amorites of committing this great evil of child sacrifice. And the archaeological evidence bears out the reality that indeed the Canaanites did practice this evil and were guilty. Now some might argue, well, the Canaanites weren't treated fairly because they didn't have God's law. God didn't give them his law. However, God has created all people to know in their hearts whether something like a practice of sacrificing children is good or evil. And it's clearly, we all know in our hearts, our conscience-bearing witness, that it is an evil practice. So everyone is without excuse.
Because the number one argument against the Old Testament is what? God is mean. God is mean. No, God is just. If he's not just, he's not God. And where is justice going to be for these babies that are burned and for these children that are sacrificed?
So many people go to Gezer, they picnic there, they visit there, they hike, they bike, and they're going along and they look and they see these 12 standing stones in a row, and they see this basin cut into this rock, and they're like, what on earth is this place? And so there's a information sign up on the top of the hill overlooking the site. And so many of them go over to get an explanation of the site from this sign. The sign says, scholars believe the temple served as a venue where alliances between tribes or city-states were forged or renewed. The 10 monoliths may have symbolized the city of Gezer and 9 allied cities in its vicinity. The basin may have served as a container for a blood libation poured during an alliance ceremony. So obviously this interpretation is very different from the original interpretation that was given by the archaeologists that excavated the site. Where is all the evidence? Where's the mention of the burned babies in jars? Where's the mention of the severed vertebrae of these children that had been cut in half and beheaded? What essentially has happened is they've removed the crime from the crime scene, therefore making it not a crime scene at all. It's very different if God calls for the complete destruction of a people who are just making an alliance with each other than if he's calling for their destruction because they're murdering innocent children. Oh man, I try to imagine today what it would be like if somebody today wrote in an excavation report that this is evidence for the iniquity of the Amorites. I mean, that would be off the scales politically incorrect. However, it is the right interpretation. That is the practice that was going on at the high place of Gezer, and the Bible was the right tool to use to bring out that understanding. And so what has changed over the years? The Bible hasn't changed. The evidence in the ground that was found hasn't changed. What has changed is scholarship's interpretation of this type of evidence. Because over time, as the field became more and more secular, then the secular agenda, which teaches that man by nature is basically good, couldn't have a bunch of Canaanites running around sacrificing children. And so the later interpretations were these alliances and were these other explanations of what this evidence actually was, which overturned the previous biblical interpretations that represented what actually had happened in these places. And so as I was taught in my archaeology classes over and over again, I was taught that there is no evidence at all that the Canaanites sacrificed their children. So it became over time politically incorrect to interpret your finds the way that McAllister's and others had interpreted them for many years previous to that.